The late George Harrison. He is being eulogized as a musical genius, a spiritual explorer, and above all, a gentle and a good man. Overshadowed by Lennon and McCartney, George was the quiet Beatle who cherished his solitude. But of the four Beatles, Harrison was the first to reach the top of the charts with a solo album and to experiment with new forms of music. George Harrison will, of course, always be known as one-fourth of the world's most famous band. But his life and his music transcended the Beatles.
He wasn't someone who ever hogged the spotlight, probably to a flaw.
I think he'll be remembered as an immensely creative man who was not in love with his own face or his own stardom or his own ego.
He's like my son, he's like my younger brother, my friend, my disciple, all combined together.
The world will never let go that he's Beatle George. I mean, there's no way to get rid of that.
He was one of the four most beloved, most adulated faces that the world has ever seen, that perhaps ever will see again.
In 1943, Liverpool, England was a bleak place. The port city was left scarred by the bombs of the German Blitzkrieg of 1940, and the economy reflected the austerity of a country at war. It was here, among the seafaring population, that George Harrison was born on February 25, 1943. George was the youngest of Harold and Louise Harrison's four children.
Harrison came from very ordinary parents, although it was at a time when you could be poor and you could be happy. They weren't people who went after state benefit and that sort of thing. The family had good jobs. They were a stable family.
Though times were hard, George's father found steady work as a bus driver. And thanks to his former job as a ship steward on an ocean liner, he had access to something that would change his youngest son's life.
Liverpool had this strange position of being a seaport where the transatlantic ocean liners docked, and the stewards on those liners and the crew brought back these import records that nobody else had heard in the country, really in the country. So a lot of boys in Liverpool picked up on this American blues music.
George loved the Depression-era train songs of musician Jimmy Rogers. But by the time he entered the Liverpool Institute, the next generation of ship stewards had discovered something even more exciting. It was called rock and roll.
It was like a dispatch from a distant land where, there was excitement and energy at a time when Britain was still recovering from the pounding it had received during World War II.
School, of course, took a back seat to rock and roll, and George was soon spending more time learning guitar chords than anything else.
He didn't really have much to do with school activities, and he in fact did very poorly at school, to the extent where he was in very much of a danger of being sort of kept down a year.
Although they may have been disappointed by their son's poor academic performance, his parents did not object to his new passion.
His mother in particular was a rather jolly and eccentric woman who encouraged him to be a little bit different. Now, being a little bit different in the late 50s, the middle to late 50s, was that you played the guitar and you liked rock and roll.
George liked being different. That was apparent from his slicked hair and skin-tight pants. But he was not satisfied to just look the part. He wanted to master the role.
It wasn't easy for him to learn the guitar. He wasn't a natural musician. He would practice till his fingers bled.
He learnt to play the bits on the records, the American records, that other boys didn't know. Therefore, he seemed like a virtuoso because he could play a Chuck Berry solo.
George Harrison clearly heard the Carl Perkins stuff. He clearly heard R&B stuff, and just found sort of the roots of his own style, which would basically define rock and roll guitar.
George was practicing music with an older schoolmate named Paul McCartney. And before long, Paul introduced George to his friend John Lennon. Paul and John had a band called the Quarrymen, and George wanted in.
John was very much the leader of the Quarrymen, and I think that he regarded George as very much a sort of kid hanging around all the time, although in fact George was a much better guitarist than either John or Paul then.
He could play a bass guitar instrumental number known as Raunchy. It was an American song. When they got on the bus to go home, John used to say, "Oh, go on, George, play us Raunchy." And George would pick out the bass notes and they'd say, "Great."
Lennon was amused and impressed by George's performances on the bus and asked him to join the band. He jumped at the chance. The group performed wherever they could and under less than ideal conditions. They did manage to make an amateur recording of themselves playing a Buddy Holly song called That'll Be the Day. That'll be the day when I die. The band added a bass player named Stuart Sutcliffe, renamed themselves the Silver Beatles, and began playing regularly in local clubs. It wasn't long before they were offered their first tour outside the UK. And now, calling themselves the Beatles, they made their way to the bohemian club scene in Hamburg. It was unlike anything 17-year-old George had ever seen or even imagined.
He was in the centre of the red light district amongst all the sort of pimps and prostitutes and strippers and sort of all the local sort of Al Capones. And it was rather a sort of eye-stretching sort of experience for somebody so young.
I'm pretty sure that he lost his virginity in Hamburg, probably several times. And certainly got, certainly got his first initiations into drugs, serious drinking, and possibly venereal disease.
The group's music reflected their new lifestyle.
They were very loud, they wore leather, they played at grotesquely exaggerated tempo, and they spent most of their marathon shows blitzed out of their head on amphetamines.
The band lasted 7 months in Hamburg until local authorities learned that George was only 17 and had him deported.
Because they were playing in a red light district, everybody had to have an ID card. And at midnight, anybody under the age of 18 had to leave the whole area. And there was on stage, you know, smashed out of his brains because he couldn't handle alcohol, was George Harrison, playing till 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning.
George was deeply disappointed by the turn of events, but in fact, he was returning to Liverpool a changed man.
I think that he actually sort of absorbed years and years of maturity within a few months as a result of that. And I think that, if anything, Hamburg, rather than the Liverpool Institute, was his true education.
In the winter of 1960, the Beatles returned from Hamburg to Liverpool. To some, they looked like a completely different band.
They just changed beyond recognition. The first time I saw them, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It was absolutely fantastic. The sound just went right through my body. I gave him 12 bookings that first night. George never said a word, just looked at me because he was younger than them and he was very shy, and even when he first joined the group, they sort of would hardly let him speak.
The group soon took up residence at a dingy backstreet jazz club.
They began to play at the Cavern Club, which was an underground club in the centre of Liverpool, which had been a cheese, or underneath a cheese warehouse. This place stank of mouldy cheese rind and was incredibly hot and squalid.
Despite the questionable venue, Harrison took his music very seriously. He was, as always, anxious to learn more.
First met George, of course, when we first played with the Beatles down here. And my biggest memory of the first meeting George is all he wanted to talk about is my guitar and his guitar and what licks I'd learned.
He was a perfectionist, George. And I think if his guitar playing hadn't have improved, he might well have packed in.
The Beatles' reputation spread, and in the fall of 1961, they came to the attention of a local record store owner named Brian Epstein. He went to a lunchtime concert to see what all the fuss was about.
And he thought the band were great. And he decided that he was going to make it a project to manage the Beatles and get them signed to a major record company in the UK.
Brian Epstein did become their manager. Epstein had the boys clean up their act, trading leather outfits for mohair suits and polishing their performances. He also encouraged them to write more of their own songs.
He said, you're never going to be known for doing covers. You're only going to be known for doing your own material.
Epstein soon arranged a meeting between the Beatles and record producer George Martin, who signed them up. There was a change almost immediately. In August of 1962, the band ousted drummer Pete Best and replaced him with Ringo Starr. In October, the boys released their first single, Love Me Do. It became a top 20 hit, but their first album, Please Please Me, became a phenomenon, topping the UK charts 4 months later.
After that, it was plain sailing. They caught on. They had gimmick haircuts, gimmick accents, you know, you name it. But I mean, the main strength they had was the fact they had a very strong songwriting team in John and Paul.
Nearly overnight, the band became a huge sensation in England, and they began a non-stop series of nationwide concert, radio, and TV appearances.
Happy Christmas, all the best.
Thank you.